You're listening to The Big Lift, the podcast of Web Trends Optimize, the CRO solution that enables marketers and developers to maximize the ROI on their digital properties. Web Trends Optimize is a powerful, feature-rich and easy-to-use solution, all delivered within a fixed-price contract with no additional cost for increased functionality ever. During these podcasts, we meet some of the key influencers within the marketing and conversion world to understand their roles and examine their challenges. There are many terms that we use to define how we improve a customer experience. Testing, experimentation, conversion rate optimization. But are we guilty of creating confusion? Today I'm in conversation with Shamir Duverseau, co-founder of US-based Smart Panda Labs, who I believe has a more focused definition of how we define improving online customer experiences. Shamir, your corporate experience is vast. I mean, you've been 15 years the founder of Smart Panda Labs, but you've worked for Marriott for 5 years, you've worked for Walt Disney, NBC, Southwest Airlines Vacations. That's a lot of experience you've got under your belt. But actually, one thing I noticed is one of the quotes that's on your LinkedIn profile says, doing something the same way for 10 years doesn't mean you have 10 years of experience. It does mean you have 1 year experience repeated 10 times. So how can you make the 10 years count for something?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really cumulative. I don't mean cumulative in the sense that each year builds upon itself. It's more in the sense of what you keep learning by failing, by trying different things, going along different paths. So, for example, you mentioned some of my experience. I think about my experience at Southwest, and I was there during 9/11.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing that could have prepared you for that kind of event. And working for an airline when that was happening and seeing all the flights get grounded and people who were displaced away from home. At the time, I was working supporting their vacation packages. So these were people who were on vacation, and now all of a sudden they're stuck hundreds, thousands of miles away from home. Working through that situation, that experience teaches you to kind of take what life gives you, so to speak, and learn to adapt and find a way to be able, in that case, to service customers, but also to service the business and to keep things moving forward. And it's those kind of experiences that kind of teach you that you can't bank on things turning out the way that they have before, but you can pick up the tools, you can learn the principles that you can apply to multiple situations and just discern, okay, how do I apply them moving forward, right? So it's really about failing, about learning, about iterating over time, and really any good organization, the successful ones do that today. They're about experimentation, not just as an A/B test on a website, but about a cultural thought process around experimentation, around learning, around failing, and about using that information to gain insight about how they can move forward in the future. And that's not going to be about the typical 10 or 20 years on a resume. That's going to be about the experiences you have and the principles you get from those experiences.
So it's not so much about doing things differently, it's actually learning from the bits that you've gained over the past number of years and being able to utilise some or all of those at different areas. And it might be an accumulation of maybe 4 or 5 different experiences that you've had that may build your decision-making process moving forward.
Yeah, my son, I have a 9-year-old son, and he's into Legos. It's like over the course of your career, you're accumulating all these different Lego pieces.
Yep.
And at different times, you have to build different things with those pieces, right? You need those same pieces, but what you end up constructing and building can be markedly different at different points in your career. So I think a good career, as you're accumulating those experiences, is you're accumulating those pieces and parts, and then you learn to look at the situation you're in and say, okay, what do I need to build here? Does this work? Do I need to modify what I've just built? But then a year later, it might be I need to build something completely different. The same pieces, the same building blocks, but a different purpose in terms of what you're trying to drive forward.
I also noticed on your LinkedIn post that you've mentioned, or you do mention, and presumably you've read all of these management books from the likes of Jim Collins, From Good to Great, Matthew Dick, Story Cell, Bradford Smart, Top Grading, and a host of other things like that. Do you think that that's part of the experience that you've got, or does that just lean you to do your things differently based upon what you've read?
It's funny. It's both. With some of those books, it's very much given me the ingredients of saying, here are elements I think are really important. It's given me other things to test and try and see what does and doesn't work. Sometimes it works exactly as it's spoken of by the author and laid out in the book. Sometimes it's a modification of that ends up working best for us. Other times it's, I tried this doesn't work for what we're trying to do here at Smart Panda Labs. So it really ends up becoming more fuel to the fire, so to speak, of saying, here's things I can try, here are different directions I can go, what aspects of this make the most sense, how do I kind of color this in a way that really fits into what we're trying to do and the puzzle we're trying to put together here at Smart Panda Labs. So again, it's just really been more blocks, so to speak. It's just really added to that theme of, here are these more additional pieces that I can use to create what needs to be created at the given time to drive things in a certain direction. And it's been great to do that, because as you read those different books or as you hear different ones speak, it's funny, certain themes kind of stand out that are consistent. And you learn that those threads perhaps are a little bit stronger, those blocks are a little bit bigger and more resilient. And those are things that you find ways to incorporate into the business, and you see why there are these common threads that stand out. Other things are much more nuanced, and those are the things that you kind of more play with and discern, okay, does this fit at all? If it does fit, does it fit exactly this way? Or is there some kind of modification of this that makes more sense?
So I've worked in startups, West Coast startups mainly, for a large proportion of my career. And one of the things I really like about startups is they're very agile. They're very, let's go and do things. Forget about process and things like that, or process. Just do it whatever it needs to be done to get what you need to get done in those early years. But actually, as those kind of startups progress, and I would call you as a fairly mature startup now as 15 years, don't systems start to take over? So how do you break out of those to become continually agile and continually, I suppose, doing things differently based upon your experience?
Yeah, that's been a real learning experience for us, because you're right, those systems do quickly develop for a number of different reasons. Just because as you're human, you get in the habit of doing different things and just kind of fall into the habit. We've had times where maybe a team member came in and created a certain system, and because that team member was so respected, it's kind of, well, this is the way that so-and-so set this up, so this is the way that we do it. What we try to do as a team is we try to challenge ourselves to think about our processes and systems and what do and don't make sense. When we have our regular meetings as a team, one of the things that we put on there is a review of processes, a review of the systems that we've put into place, and ask ourselves, do these still make sense the way they are? Do we need to make changes? Do we need to try different things and iterate? And what we've found since doing that for these last few years is we end up making a lot of changes. We end up making tweaks and iterations from time to time in a lot of those processes and systems that we have. We'll try them for a while. We ask ourselves, do they make sense? Do we need to continue to tweak them? Or do we go with this new way of doing it? Then we'll move on to another system. And as you well know, the interaction between those systems is really powerful. So what ends up happening is you make a change to one system to improve it, to make it a bit more fluid, a bit less taxing on the team. Mm-hmm. And once you do that, it kind of shifts the pain to another system of like, well, now we're running into a bottleneck here at this different place in the process. Yeah. Oh, we need to refine that. Then you do that, and then it shifts the pain to another. So the pain always ends up coming to the fore. That's one thing that we've really learned over the years. Whether it's processes, whether it's people, the weakest link always ends up highlighting itself. And we try to do the best that we can to highlight that weak link, address it as best we can, and then see, okay, now where is the weakness shifting? Because it's shifting somewhere. Where is that shifting? Now let's address that. And to constantly kind of keep that moving target in our sights, so to speak. And that kind of forces us to keep changing our systems and evolving them based on how the market's changing, how our competitors are changing, how our business is changing.
One of the things that I'll point out is there's some people that love change, and continuous, iterations is one way of being able to do that. But other people find it very, very difficult and quite resistant to that change. How does this kind of constant evolution rather than evolution have an effect on your staff? And do you have to get to the point of saying, actually, sometimes it's that guy that was good 2 years ago just now doesn't fit?
Yeah, I think overall, one of the things that we've learned is that we need to hire a staff that has the right personality fit for what we're trying to do. And a big part of that is not so much about embracing change, but maybe just understanding that as the saying goes, change is the world's only constant. So this really isn't an issue of we like change or we don't like change. This is an issue of we have to deal with reality. And reality is change. That's just what happens. So having a team of people who just understand that basic truth allows people not so much to look at it as constant change, but just to say that we'll make these adjustments from time to time to help things be better. And that's, that may sound like semantics. I'm using the word adjustment versus change. I actually had to stop myself from using the word change again, right? And sometimes it is semantics, right? It's the connotation of the word. And, change often has a negative connotation to it, as opposed to a word like tweak or adjustment or iteration, which ultimately all mean the exact same thing when all is said and done. But just removing that connotation has this negative stigma and just saying the world around us is in constant flux. Therefore, by definition, any organization, any person for that matter, needs to some degree be in constant flux to keep in step with what's happening around them. So hiring people that really understand that and embrace that allows that to happen in a good way. And we found that when we've tried, as best as we've tried to assess the right kinds of team members, maybe going through many rounds of interviews and so forth, when we miss on the personality front, that's where we end up kind of paying the consequences. Not because we found bad people or people who are ignorant or stupid. These are experienced, great professional people, but the personality fit just doesn't work. And just having that alignment along the personality of the team is what we found to be most effective. And we'll see a long-term team member who can make those adjustments and tweaks and iterations and changes right over time if they have the right personality fit versus those that don't, and it just doesn't work out.
I'd like to move on now to actually Smart Panda Labs, because I think looking at your website, you've come up with a phrase which I really love. It's not that I just like it, I actually love it because it does something in the brain that changes people's thought process. And that's the phrase post-click experience. How does that resonate with your prospects?
We find that people get it pretty quickly, especially once we very quickly kind of articulate what that means. Again, you say that, and as you mentioned, it's not something that's kind of in the modern vernacular, even of digital. But once we kind of talk about the ad and the click that people look for, and then saying, well, what happens after that? People begin to understand it and begin to grasp it. So I think it's starting to resonate more and more as we speak more and more about it and kind of shine a light on it as something that really, we would argue, matters the most in the overall realm of the digital experience. The Metas of the world, the Googles of the world, they put a lot of energy and effort into how they make money, which is advertising. Yeah. And I mean, think about it. I just named two of the most significant companies in the world, right? I mean, these are part of the Magnificent Seven, right? Meta and Google. And, their ad revenues are what's driving all that. Yeah. So their vested interest is to keep marketers focused on advertising, as advertising just being the solution to all their problems. Like this is all about advertising. And we know it's not, and it's never been about advertising, right? Yeah. It's about what happens after someone interacts with that ad and then has to actually make a decision and say, am I going to buy something? You can run the best TV commercial in the world, but eventually someone's going to have to go to your website. Someone's going to have to go to your store. They're going to have to make a decision as to whether or not they're going to buy your product. And when they're at the website or when they're at the store and they're shopping, at that point, the last thing they're thinking about is that commercial or that digital ad they clicked on. At this point, they're trying to get enough information to say, does this product make sense for me? Does this service make sense for me? That's all post-click experience. That's really where the rubber meets the road, as it were. And us trying to focus on that, I think, is trying to help people to think about this in a different way. And it's starting to resonate, as you mentioned, just by giving it a bit of its own name of, hey, there's the pre-click and there's the post-click. Yeah. There's what happens after that experience, and that's where you need to invest time and energy and money. And that's where people are ultimately going to make a decision, not just for this initial purchase, but even for future purchases as well, right? So now it's not just about driving revenue, it's about driving profitability, it's about driving lifetime value. So it really becomes a much, much more important experience.
And would you say that the 80-20 rule, say ad spend versus experimentation, CRO, whatever you like to call it, is the wrong percentages? Do you think it needs a bit of adjustment along the way?
Yeah, I really do. I really think that, again, I think things have been biased. And I mean, that's just good business, right? I mean, you want people to feel like your product is the most valuable in the world. You want that value prop to be the thing that first and foremost comes to people's minds. But I definitely think it's a shift. I think it's a harder shift. I think to the credit of the advertisers in the world, of the Metas and Googles and others in the world, to their credit, advertising, relatively speaking, is easy. Not to say that targeting is easy or creative is easy, but from a marketer's standpoint, that's an easier thing to drive forward. You can work with an agency, or you can work with maybe a contractor or a specialist who's able to deliver on that and get that up and running very quickly. It's a quick fix, so to speak. Whereas once you get to that post-click experience, things become far more complicated very quickly. Yeah. Now you're talking about not just marketing, but you're talking about IT, and you're talking about product, and you're talking about bringing those things into alignment. And oftentimes these teams don't communicate very well. They speak different languages. And getting those things into alignment can be a challenge. It can be a lot of work and effort. It's just easier to switch your focus and energy and say, well, we'll just focus on the ads and we'll just drive more traffic. And that'll be the way that we solve our problems. But that's not sustainable.
I do agree with your viewpoint that marketers may spend up to 6 months perfecting an ad, getting the right creative, etc. And then when it gets to reviewing the landing page, they kind of go, oh, I've done all my work. Mm-hmm. It's kind of, I'll breathe a sigh of relief, or whatever it might be. So I think there's lots of different ways to be able to focus in the mind, and that phrase post-click experience, I think, actually sums it up very, very nicely. And having that pre-click and post-click is a very good idea too. You also mentioned that it's beneficial when you're kind of collaborating that, what does the perfect ad creative, landing page creative work together, bringing in data analysts early on, even on creative brainstorms and things like that. Could you elaborate on that and why you think that's positive?
Yeah, certainly. Again, sometimes we marketers get in very bad habits. And one of those habits is we lean on our own creativity a bit too much, as opposed to thinking about things from the customer perspective. I think we talk a lot about thinking about things from the customer perspective, but when reality hits, we hesitate to actually do that. So that's the advantage of bringing in the data analysts, because they can help to validate things. They can help to keep us more grounded. We can start to ask ourselves the question before we even start putting pen to paper, so to speak, and actually designing in creative. What is this page trying to accomplish? Well, I guess the question for that is, what does the person need to know in order to make this purchase? What information do they need in order to make a decision to say, I'm going to put my credit card in and I'm going to hit submit, right? I'm going to hit confirm. So that's kind of the first part of it, right? That's the foundation. The second part of it is really about understanding that things are far more three-dimensional than they used to be. So you're trying to figure out what information does a customer need, but those needs can oftentimes be in a bit of a flux as well. So now we're thinking about elements of things like personalization and how we personalize that experience. Well, now that landing page may begin to change based on people's behaviors, based on the initial visit versus a secondary or subsequent visit to that particular experience. So creatives being able to understand what those changes might involve, what elements of the page might end up changing, that's going to be critically important to how they lay out the page and how they design it, and how they structure the architecture of not just the page, but the overall experience that you're looking to drive a person through. And again, that perspective comes from those data analysts and the information that they're able to surface and bring to the table to help provide that proper perspective. So we find by both helping to understand those fundamental questions up front around the value proposition and how we want to make that front and center, but then also elements like personalization and highlighting that on a consistent basis, how the experience will change and iterate. Those two things really bring creative and data into alignment.
I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here. Shouldn't the analysts be there before the creative starts rather than be there during the creative process? They should be there as well, But I think that coming to the table with some data about what things should be tested or what experiments should be run probably sits more with the analyst rather than the creative. Would you not agree?
Oh, 100%. Yeah. Yeah. I guess when I say when they're sitting there together, in our minds, that they're there at the same time, but that conversation is starting with the data analysts, right? They're the ones starting the conversation because essentially they are the ones representing the customer. They're the ones with the research. They're the ones with the insight. They're the ones with the data saying, hey, before we even get started, let's make sure we're all on the same page of when people are trying to buy product A, here's what they're looking for. Here's what the data says they're searching for. Here's the key information they need in order to make an informed decision. Now that we all understand that and we all have that as our baseline, now let's start to talk about how we begin to deliver that creatively. How do we now begin to meet those needs with design elements? So yeah, 100%, they're all in the room at the same time,
right.
But the conversation starts with the data because the data is the representation of the customer and their perception and experience.
So I 100% agree with you, and I'm not going to argue with you, but I think in many organisations, especially the smaller ones, data analysis is a bit of a luxury still, and marketers are still there, I suppose, driving their gut feel to a greater or lesser degree, and need some help to be able to make that happen. Do you think marketers ought to train more in analysing data?
I do. I think two areas that are really underrepresented in terms of the kind of the modern marketer are data analysis, so understanding data and how and what role it plays and how to extract that data and value from it, and then the more technical aspects that we kind of touched on previously. So understanding how those things and what the experience we're delivering interacts with the product, interacts with teams like IT and the world that they have to deliver. I think as we move forward, those skills are going to become more and more and more important in the marketer's portfolio of skills, so to speak, because the world is becoming more technical and it's becoming more data driven. So you've got to have that mix in order to deliver the kind of experience that people really expect and demand at this point in time. So I think both those skills are critical. Now, do you have to be a data scientist as a marketer? No. No one's saying that. Do you have to be a front end or a back end developer as a marketer? No. But you've got to be comfortable with the concepts and you've got to be comfortable with the principles to be able to know the right questions to ask, to be able to have the right conversations, to say, hey, look, we may not be able to tap into this, but I know enough to get some information out of GA4, or I know enough to say we need to get a contractor for a few hours to get some key information to be able to make this decision about how we want to lay out this web page or this checkout experience.
Yeah, I tend to agree because marketers and analysts tend to be right side, left side of brain. So they're quite different how they're made up. So having a bridge that goes between the two with information from a marketer's perspective about data and having an analyst's perspective about user behaviour seems like a very good mix.
Exactly.
One thing I also noticed on your website is that the best marketers don't just attract the right people, it actively filters out the wrong ones. So how do you think that companies can manage of potentially alienating all of their potential customers?
Honestly, it's really a philosophical, cultural view that the organization has to take on, which a lot of organizations don't feel comfortable taking on. Mm-hmm. And if they don't, then they don't. And some people just like to try to be all things to all people, and more power to them. And I'm not saying that's definitively wrong. I would just argue that saying that we're going to make our core customer happy, and if that means alienating people who aren't our core customer, our target customer, then so be it. I think that's a better way of doing it. And I think I would argue that the most successful brands do that very well. The best brands are dearly loved and they're extremely hated. There are people who love Apple and there are people who absolutely hate it.
Yep.
There are people who love Southwest Airlines and absolutely hate it. There are people who love Disney and absolutely hate it. But that's what makes those brands work, right? It's that they're appealing to their particular customer, right, to their ICP, and they understand that that's going to alienate some people, and that's fine. It's like the Walmart Target debate that we have here.
All right.
There are people who love one and hate the other, and vice versa, and it works to the advantage of both those brands, right? Because they know who they're talking to, and these other people are the ones that we're not talking to. So I think it's a cultural, it's a philosophical thing that an organization has to take on. I'm not saying that you can't be successful without doing that, but I would argue you will be more successful if you embrace that and do that.
I was going to say that must be quite a difficult task to be able to differentiate between Walmart and Target, because they're fairly similar in their identity and what they present to the customer. So it must be subtle nuances, or just downright don't go to Walmart if you're a Target customer and don't go to Target if you're a Walmart customer, and being very open about that position that they stand for. Do you think that's a good way for clients to think differently about how they position the stuff on their website?
I think it's a good way for them to say, it's a good way for them to put things into the proper perspective. Mm-hmm. So I think ultimately all they need to do to do this is not so much think about, well, we're going to alienate certain people or certain people are going to love us. It's, let's define who is our target ICP for our product, right? Who are we making this for? Who does this best serve? What needs is this accomplishing? Great. Let's speak to that audience. Now, do I think they need to spend a whole lot of time, especially up front, kind of analyzing, well, what about the people who aren't our audience and how is that going to affect them? Not really. I think that will kind of take care of itself, so to speak. I think it's just more about saying, if we embrace the right ICP and we give them what they need, we're going to create the kind of, not just like upfront conversions, but the kind of lifetime value, the kind of loyalty that we're looking for, hopefully even the kind of evangelism that we're looking for, that's going to be our base, and then we can grow from there. And essentially, and I don't want to oversimplify things, I mean, we're talking about multi-million-dollar companies, but essentially everything else will kind of take care of itself. Now, there will come a time where some executive or some team member is going to step up and say, well, we could grow market share if we begin to service these people, or we begin to service these people. And at that point, I think you have to then say, okay, well what does that mean? Does that mean we're somehow sacrificing or watering things down for our core ICP? Do we want to do that? Does that mean that maybe we're spinning things off and maybe forming another brand to do that? And I think about like a lot of the CPG companies, the consumer packaged goods, where you have brands that are very female oriented, right? Like a Dove brand, whereas the same company owns Axe, which is very male oriented, right? Yeah. Two completely contrasting messages, right?
Yeah.
Feeding two different audiences, not just in terms of gender, but just in terms of the feel and the connotation of those brands. But it's like, hey, we can meet both markets, but we're not going to try to do this in one brand. We're going to do this in two, right? So I think there's different ways to still get at that, but still get at the core of saying, this is our ICP, this is who we're speaking to, this is what we're going to embrace, and we're going to go for that. And if we feel like we need to embrace another group of people, well, there might be a better way of doing that, as opposed to saying, okay, now Dove is going to come out with a whole nother line that's going to service men, and this is going to talk to men in a very different way. Well, it's like, well, now we're off brand, and now we're diluting our message, right? And that's going to hurt us more than it's going to help us. So how about we just have a whole nother brand, right? That's completely separate and different, that I would argue the most majority of people don't know that those two companies are owned by the same parent company, right? Nor that they need to know that. But it allows them to accomplish their goal. So,
I'd just like to pull back in a couple of areas that we've talked about, which is one about systems and the other one about this 80-20 rule, or the marketing spend. Because we've got this thing that's sitting out on the horizon and getting closer and closer, where AI is starting to come into creative content. And people, rightly or wrongly, believe that AI could actually substitute for a marketer, specifically a content marketer. But do you believe that there's actually a good argument to still get customers to be using experimentation to actually drive their business forward without automating the whole process?
I think there is. I think when all is said and done, we're marketing to humans. And if we ever think that a machine can market to humans as well as another human can, I think we're just fooling ourselves. Now, I think the machines can help to accelerate that. I think they can help to refine it. I think they can help to to surface key pieces of information and data far more quickly than a human can on their own. And I think those are valuable tools. But I think ultimately that human touch is going to be necessary. I mean, I've seen plenty of posts on LinkedIn, and you probably have too. And the ones that are 100% written by AI and like untouched, and we just took this from ChatGPT and posted it, I mean, I can pick those out very quickly. You can read it, right? Because it's good and it's complete, and the thoughts are nice and they're smart, and it's fluid, it's grammatically correct, but it's stale, right? There's no heart to it. There's no personality to it because it's a machine. It's not written by a human. Yeah. And again, you think about the best marketing out there, the best brands out there. They've got emotion, right? They've got heart, right? They play at your heartstrings in some way, form, or fashion.
That's the word I was looking for. Emotion.
Yeah, and I think you lose that with the machine. Now, again, I think a machine can help you get started. I think it can help you move faster. I think all those things are true. I just think that when it comes down to it, if you truly want to be effective, you've got to find the emotion and how you're tugging at those heartstrings. And I think experimentation does play a role in that in terms of saying what's the right way, what resonates with people in terms of doing that. And I think you need that human touch to tweak and to adjust and to adapt in the right way to find that right message and that right tone, so to speak.
I think it's going to be a watch this space and see how things progress. I was actually on a site this morning about stocks and shares and being able to say, okay, this experiment was let AI choose the top shares to invest, £50,000 in, and then an investment company did the same thing. And AI came back with what you would describe as a fairly rock solid invest in what we call the Times top 100 companies. And the other investment company came up with more riskier kind of things, but a better return. So I think there is somewhat of a balance between AI actually producing information based upon fact rather than based upon, well, I think this is good. Not so much gut feeling, but using their experience, which is what we talked about well up front.
Exactly. I was just thinking that same thought. It's funny you use it as an example. I read a book recently, The Psychology of Money. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but the author makes a nice point. He talks about what's rational versus what's reasonable.
Yeah.
And oftentimes on paper, what's a rational decision doesn't necessarily match up with what's just reasonable for a person. So it may be rational to say, don't pay off that debt. Take that money and invest it in this particular, in the market or whatever the case is, because the return you'll get in the investment will outweigh what you gain by paying off this debt based on interest rates and so forth. And you do the math and say, well, on paper that makes sense, but I would feel a lot better if I paid off this debt.
Yeah.
Right. I would feel a lot better if I eliminated this $5,000 or this $10,000 debt. That's a human thing, right? A machine can't accommodate for that, and that means something, right? There's value in that too as well, right? So it's in those human emotional spaces that the machine can guide you and direct you in a certain direction, but it can't ultimately make the decision because what's rational and what's reasonable aren't always the same thing. And what's reasonable for people differs a great deal by the person, by the organization, by the family, right? So you make those definitions as to what's reasonable for you, and those definitions are in constant flux as well, right? So a machine can't possibly compensate or keep up for that, though it can't help you in terms of pointing you in the right direction or giving you the information that you need to make the decision you want to make.
Yeah, I entirely agree. Just talking about that, it takes me back to my days as a sales guy, where we talked about two different ways of being able to sell. And I think it's still relevant in the marketing field as well. We talked about FUDs, which was fears, uncertainties and doubts, to be able to dislodge people's thinking about where they were in a position. It works pretty well in finance as well. And the other ones were features, advantages and benefits. And I think from a marketing point of view, we utilize those kind of thought processes, but not, I suppose, as clearly as we could do, because some of the things that we talk about, the features, advantages and benefits, we tend to lose a lot of the benefits, especially from looking at it from a consumer's perspective, and talk about features a lot. And I would say there's a lot of talk in that in B2B more than B2C. But I think we're still harking back to this question that I posed in the very start, which is something that's happened in your life or your experience. If you pull that into the place in the right time with the right kind of markets positioning, I think that experience can pull out those kind of bits and pieces which are going to benefit your organisation to get on better. So I'm still, I would prefer to have an employee with experience rather than one that's got qualification. They might be the same candidate, but experience to me trumps being able to have the right qualifications. Now, that's not to say that qualifications are not good, because obviously the world has changed over the last even 5 years, and having qualifications based upon modern thinking, using analytics for making changes to websites is very, very positive. But I think we've got to continue to have that mix of everybody around the table, the analysts, the marketers, and those people who are even selling the product. What do they feel about the product? The product managers that are in that room as well, to be able to make sure that they're trying to win more times than they lose.
No, I 100% agree. 100%. I think it's an issue of not getting too lost in the weeds, which I think we're so guilty of, right? Of just kind of doing to do, as opposed to taking that step back that we need to take, which experience teaches you, and saying, okay, like we need to kind of reset here. What are we trying to accomplish here? What direction are we going? We're getting lost in the weeds, and we're just doing things in order to do them, and we're not really moving that much forward. We're not really accomplishing a whole lot when all is said and done. So let's take a step back. Let's look at things from a different perspective, from the customer perspective, and let's see what we're trying to accomplish and do. And then let's put these things in an order, in a way that's actually moving us in a positive direction, that we're actually picking up some momentum.
Shamir, it's been a great discussion. We're getting up to about 40 minutes here. So I think that it's something that we ought to revisit again, maybe in 18 months or 2 years' time, because things are changing so much. And not only that, the world is changing, and how we position ourselves, and those fears, uncertainties and doubts, I think, are coming to a lot of people's in their decision-making process of where they spend their money, obviously with economic challenges that are happening in not just our part of the world, but everywhere else. So it would be good to be able to touch base again and see how things lie in maybe 2026, 2027, and see if things have changed much.
I think that'd be great. I look forward to it.
Shamir, thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, John.